invited me here. Let me see if we can get this working. We were all moved by the testimony of Madame Muhongerwa. And the thing that moved us was not only the facts that she related, but also the sense of the serenity and the dignity with which 20 years later she managed to convey them, whilst making it perfectly clear that they are not just chapters in history, that they are still living, that they are living memories. The reason why I'm here, ladies and gentlemen, is that while Mathilde was suffering in Rwanda 20 years ago, I was on the other end of the world, on the other end of the social spectrum perhaps, representing a small Central European country on the UN Security Council. I was the ambassador of the Czech Republic. And in April of 1994, the Security Council had all manner of issues on its agenda, anything ranging from Somaliland to Bosnia to Tajikistan, and including Rwanda even before the fatal plane crash. The amazing thing was that the moment the plane crashed on April 5th, the then ambassador of Rwanda to the UN, to the United Nations, who coincidentally and Rwanda coincidentally was also a member of the UN Security Council, he knew straight away what had happened. He knew straight away, and this was, let me recall, this was the Hutu government's ambassador to the UN. He knew straight away that this was all the plane crash and which killed 2 presidents was the work of the RPF. The UN Security Council's main concern at that time was the fate of our UN soldiers that were there in the operation called UNAMIR. Louis Michel already mentioned the 10 Belgian paratroopers that were slaughtered on like a day after the catastrophe erupted. But meanwhile, those of us who were sitting on the council were very much in the dark. There was an awful lot of stuff that we didn't understand. Some people, we got news about the killings, the news about the massacres, and some people would describe it, for want of better understanding, as a humanitarian catastrophe. For many people it was difficult to distinguish at the time between the 2 types of conflicts that were going on in Rwanda simultaneously. One was the civil war between the RPF on the one hand and the government troops on the other hand. But the other conflict was the wholesale slaughter of the Tutsi civilian population. To distinguish these 2 turned out not to be intuitively obvious, not to be clear. And so some people would argue, what we need now is a ceasefire in Rwanda, not realizing the consequences, which would be that the ceasefire between the Hutu government's forces and the RPF would only free the hands of the genocidaire to even further intensify the slaughter of the Hutus that was happening behind the actual line of the front line. We didn't realize the scope of what was going on. It was frankly difficult to realize that, because the speed of the genocide was something outside anybody's experience. I think it's fair to say that there wasn't a single diplomat in the room who could have imagined a genocide. This was 20 years, roughly, correct me if I'm wrong, after Cambodia. This was decades and decades after Hitler's slaughter of the Jews. Genocide as such was not a word in our vocabulary. particularly not a genocide which was going on at such a tremendous speed of tens of thousands of people being killed daily. So it was at the tail end of a curve which would describe our experiences, a tail end which one sort of never considers as real. We had precious little information from our own sources. There were only a few embassies that were functioning in Kigali at the time. And for example, there wasn't, for example, a British embassy at all. There was a Belgian one, but Belgium wasn't on the UN Security Council. There was a French one, but the French played a very strange, to put it very mildly, very strange role in the whole Rwanda developments. And we saw that in the activities of Ambassador Jean-Bernard Mérimée, who was representing France on the UNSC at the time. There was a US embassy there, but the US, I'll get back to the US in a minute. The important thing is that we were not getting good enough information from the UN Secretariat, starting with Boutros Boutros-Ghali. So for days and for weeks, we were, and I wasn't the only one. It was not just because I come from a small country in Central Europe that I wouldn't have known what was happening. There was a number of countries, a number of delegations, a number of ambassadors who felt that they were more or less in the dark, just groping for whatever information they could get. And the information that we did get in the end came not from the Secretariat, not from the embassies, but from an NGO. For me, the critical piece of information came from the Human Rights Watch. And the moment I saw a particular op-ed piece in the New York Times where the Human Rights Watch, where a representative of the Human Rights Watch explained how that organization sees what was going on in Rwanda, everything became clear. It became clear why Boutros-Ghali was not giving us information, what the position of France was, what the actual situation was in Rwanda, and that opened my eyes completely. And then it was possible for a certain number of representatives, largely of small countries, led primarily by the brilliant New Zealand ambassador Colin Keating, and who was presiding over the UN Security Council in the month of April 1994, to argue, to cajole, to mobilize, to try to rouse the UN Security Council to some activity. For me, there were 2 points, generally speaking, which were important. One point came from the history of my country, when in 1938, when Hitler was about to occupy a big chunk of my country, which was inhabited by ethnic Germans, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain would argue, why should we, I'm paraphrasing, why should we lose sleep, why should we worry about, and listen to this, a small, faraway country about which we don't know much. And this was my feeling. We have to worry about a small, faraway country in the middle of Africa, even if we don't know much about it. This was one sentiment. And the other sentiment was to the address of those who would argue for a ceasefire between the RPF and the Hutu government's military, was arguing that way would be putting the Tutsi population, Tutsi civilians, at total mercy of the Hutus. This is like arguing that there should have been a ceasefire between the Nazis and the Jews. You get the drift. I ended up being after arguing this point in the informal consultations of the United Nations, I ended up being the first person to describe what was going on in Rwanda as genocide publicly in the UN context. But so what? There's a little contribution to the history of how the Rwanda catastrophe was treated in the UN. But the fact of the matter remains that the UN Security Council did precious little to solve the situation, to resolve the tragedy, to stop the genocide. That was done by the victory of the RPF in the last analysis. And so one wonders whether there are any lessons that we ought to have, or perhaps even did draw from the experience at a horrendous price. And I would rather not have the lessons if I could manage to not have the lessons and not have the price as well. One lesson is that the UN Security Council at that time was very hidebound. It looked after its own more than it looked after people in the country that they were supposed to be protecting. I don't know whether this is still the case. Maybe not so much. Maybe not so much. One of the towering personalities of the UN who ended up writing a major analysis of what had happened in Rwanda and what the UN should continue doing is the phenomenal Algerian diplomat Lakhdar Brahimi. And we have all seen Lakhdar Brahimi doing the good works 20 years later, this time in Syria, where he's trying yet again to sort out a total mess where the UN, unfortunately, probably really can't do terribly much. Another lesson is the importance of NGOs in international politics, something which is greatly underestimated. But there are situations where people like Amnesty International, Médecins Sans Frontières, and the Human Rights Watch know better what's going on. International Crisis Group know better than diplomats know what's going on in a country. One consequence in the UN was the creation of the International Tribunal for Rwanda. Again, by the way, an initiative triggered by Colin Keating from New Zealand, my good friend. And this is the initiative which ended up spurring the preparations for creating an international criminal court, which works. Another consequence was the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, R2P, the responsibility to protect, which has been accepted as a doctrine, has tremendous difficulties in being implemented in practice, but at least it's there. It's there for people to grasp as the political situation will permit, to take it and use it in practice. Libya was probably the first, not the most successful example of its application. Because look, we look around and we see Sudan, we see South Sudan, we see the Central African Republic, and indeed we see Syria, and we wonder, what have we learned from Rwanda? What have we learned from Rwanda which is actually applicable here? And the fact of the matter is that it's not very clear. Louis Michel talked about reconciliation, calling for humility on the one hand. Let me add that true reconciliation, even 20 years later, also calls for repentance. I see precious little repentance on the part of the genocidaire. Since, for the last 20 years, as a consequence of these experiences of mine in the UN Security Council, I have been very attached to Rwanda, have been there several times, enjoy the hospitality whenever I go, and I wish Rwanda, just as Louis Michel does, all the best in its future progress. Thank you very much.